Today in this episode, I would like to talk about microscope quality, and I'd like to give you a little bit of advice on the different views of quality that people might have. So hi, hello and welcome, Microbehunter here, and one of the common questions that I receive, usually per email or sometimes over some comments over my YouTube videos, or also of course in the forum, is this microscope, this particular microscope, a sufficiently good microscope to buy? Well, in many cases, the people who want to buy a microscope are interested in buying them for hobby purposes. And it's a difficult question to answer, of course, because different people have a different view and different concepts of quality. And today in this in this podcast episode, of course, I would like to categorize quality into 4 different categories that I would like to talk about to help you a little bit to make a buying decision. Usually when people ask me what is a good microscope to buy, then I usually say, well, the best microscope is the one that you will end up using the most often. But in many cases, this is not a satisfactory answer. So I decided to make a podcast episode today where I talk a little bit about quality aspects, and I decided to do a podcast episode because it's probably going to be a little bit longer than my YouTube videos that I normally make. Well, for those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Oliver, and I'm a microscopist, a hobby microscopist. I've got a YouTube channels, actually several of them, which are all dedicated to amateur and hobby microscopy. Yeah, exploring nature and using microscopes. That's essentially one of my passions here. And of course, a microscope is an essential tool in that respect. And the market is quite large. However, this also is a nice thing. So that we have quite a wide choice of products, of devices, of microscopes available these days. But this, of course, makes it also a little bit more difficult to make an ultimate decision. Well, of course, the quality of a microscope, whatever that means, I'm going to talk about that, depends quite a bit on cost. So you always have to relate it to the cost, and there is basically no limit to the price of a microscope. So microscopes can already be bought for around, let's say, less than $100 US dollars or euros. And there is no limit to the top. But generally, there is a so-called an 80-20 rule that essentially you can get 80% of the features for about 20% of the price. And essentially, if you would like to have more features, then the price is going to explode quite a bit. So for getting 90% of the features, you have to invest already quite a lot more. It's a law of diminishing returns, as it's called. Well, many people who want to buy microscopes, and when they ask, well, is this a good microscope, they want to get optically impressive results. Sometimes to compare the images that they receive on the things that they see on YouTube, so on the YouTube videos or pictures which are posted online. And it's a myth, however, that you need the most expensive microscope to get the best results. Because in many cases, the bottleneck is not the microscope itself, but the way that the specimen is prepared and also post-processing. So contrast enhancement, digital image enhancement, and so on are very important. So it's not always the microscope that is important, or the most important thing, but sometimes also the steps that go before microscopic observation and also afterwards that play a very important role here to improve image quality. But sometimes image quality is not the thing that it's the most important thing for some people. Yeah. So in many cases, it's also like this, that you need a side-per-side comparison of the different microscopes to actually see a difference. And why is this relevant? Because sometimes people upgrade to a better microscope and then they're disappointed because they expect miracles after the upgrade. But then they discover that upgrading the microscope did not really produce the desired result. And in many cases, it's also not possible to upgrade the microscope because the microscope simply does not have any spare parts or is not sufficiently modular. And it's not possible to upgrade it. So there are some inherent limitations as well. Well, of course, I'm talking about compound microscopes here because the whole issue about stereo microscopes is a little bit different maybe sometimes. So what I would like to do now is I would like to talk about the 4 quality aspects that I was able to identify. I'm going to quickly mention them first, and then I'm going to go into more detail. Microscope quality could be optical quality, it could be mechanical quality, it could be also the features offered. Let's also count it to quality, and also serviceability, because not all microscopes can be easily maintained and serviced. And depending on what your objectives are, this basically determines how important the different aspects are here. Let's start off with optical quality, because I think this is one of the things that most people talk about when they talk about microscope quality. And sure, it is a very important aspect here, but of course not the only one. Well, microscope quality, optical quality of a microscope can include the so-called optical corrections of the objectives. And this basically means that how good is the image quality that the microscope objectives produce. And there are different types of objectives on the market, so-called achromatic objectives, semi-apochromatic or fluoride objectives, apochromatic objectives, and so on and so on. And all of these terms essentially refer to how many colors of the light spectrum are corrected, are basically focused on the plane of the so-called the intermediate plane. In other words, I do not want this to get too technical here, but light rays are refracted differently depending on the wavelengths, or in other words, depending on the color of the light. And different objectives are able to focus more of the colors onto a single point. And this results in a sharper image and also in less so-called chromatic aberrations, which is so-called color fringings. And especially if you are interested in high quality pictures under the microscope, then of course this might be of importance here. And also sharpness and clarity plays a role here. And of course, it's like this, that there is a wide range of price differences, because the more corrected an objective is the more expensive it is. So for example, the apochromatic objectives, if they are even offered by some companies, that's of course another issue here, they can be significantly more expensive. Another optical quality criterion might be whether the objective is a so-called a plan objective or not. And this refers to whether the objective is able to produce an image which is in focus and sharp all the way to the edges of the field of view. So when you look through the eyepieces of a microscope, when the center is in focus, is also the edges, the sides in focus. And in plan objectives, it's all the way clear and sharp and in focus. And this is especially important if you're doing photographic work here. But again, I think I don't need to mention this, that this of course also increases the price of the objectives quite a bit. Now, from routine microscopic observation, what you have is you do not have plan objectives, and you have so-called achromatic objectives. These are the cheapest ones and the most economical ones, and I would say that probably, a lot of people, almost all people have when they buy relatively low-cost microscopes. Now, some people require special objectives, like the so-called water immersion objectives that can be dipped into water. There are some highly specialized objectives, and those objectives can only be obtained if your microscope is from a brand, from a actually well-known brand. The common brands that are out there are no specific order: Olympus, Zeiss, Leica, and Olympus, Zeiss, and Nikon, and Leica. Here we go. And they are manufacturing microscopes for research purposes primarily. So their target group is not always necessarily the hobby microscopist, but also research institutes and hospitals. And they have highly specialized objectives, and they, of course, can be quite expensive. No question about that. But of course, the research demands require those optics. Now, if you go a little bit online to research a little bit, you're going to find that some microscopes have so-called infinity objectives. And infinity optics are not automatically better in image quality. Well, often they are, but that is not really the criterion here, because those infinity objectives still can be achromatic objectives, for example, the economical ones. But often the infinity microscopes, they have an overall better quality and of course also higher price and also better mechanical quality. And those infinity objectives can also be made a little bit larger. They are also not compatible. Those objectives are also not compatible with the other types of objectives, and they're company specific. So this essentially means that if you want to upgrade a microscope, it's already difficult for some manufacturers to upgrade it, but it might be even more difficult to upgrade it because the infinity optics are company specific, and especially for smaller companies, when they offer those infinity optics, it might become a little bit difficult to get replacement objectives. So for example, there was a company that has offered a nice infinity microscope with a 100 times oil immersion objective, and they were not offering alternatives for that. So let's say 20 times or 60 times. And this kind of shows a little bit that even though the quality might be quite fine, there's a trade-off in other areas. So generally, when you go microscope shopping, do you now have a big choice here? Well, generally, it depends on the cost of the microscope. If you buy yourself a relatively economical microscope for a couple of $100 or euros, then you're going to be already out of the box, and you will not have any possibilities to make any specific choices in that respect. They will be fitted with so-called achromatic objectives, the low cost, the economical ones, and this will be fine for most cases. But for anything better, you have to go shopping with the more well-known and also more expensive brands. So generally, I would say that the optical quality, while very important, I would say one should not invest too much hope that there are going to be significant differences here. So let's now move on a little bit. Let's not move on. I would like to maybe qualify a little bit of what I just said here. Of course, there are differences in the optical quality, but sometimes the expectations that people have might be a little bit too high here. Okay, so because the optics generally in most cases are already quite good. Unless you're buying some toy microscopes, and that's of course a different issue here. So now let's move on a little bit here. The second part that I would like to talk about is so-called mechanical quality. And what does this mean? Well, it can mean also quite a range of different things here. It can mean, for example, the tolerances, the manufacturing tolerances of the mechanics here. In many cases, it's a quality control issue. There are some moving parts in a microscope. And I've seen already some microscopes that had some smaller issues or larger issues, many of them which could be easily corrected. But this is actually a quality control issue as well. However, I've also seen some pretty bad microscopes out there where screws were, for example, not properly centered. The movement of the mechanical stage was a problem, was not smooth, or the stage, mechanical stage was not able to hold the slide because of too large tolerances, and so on and so on. Now, those problems really did not really impact the image quality or the usability of the microscope, but it was kind of evident already quite from the beginning that this was actually sloppy manufacturing. I have to also admit that in recent years I've not seen so many microscopes that were a big problem, but I would also say that a lot depends on the expectations of the person who buys the microscope, because for some people even small issues are not tolerable. But generally I would say most microscopes have smaller issues, but many cases they can be quite easily fixed. So, so this is the mechanical quality, and the next one that I would like to talk about are the features offered. Different microscopes do offer different features, which might be of more or less relevancy. And I would say that the features depend a little bit also on the category of the microscope, and I've defined somewhat arbitrarily, I have to tell you, 4 different microscope categories. And the features that come associated with that, So, for example, there are the toy microscopes. I already briefly mentioned them, but I do not want to talk much more about those. So-called introductory microscopes, intermediate and advanced microscopes. And I would say that toy microscopes should be generally disregarded because with a little bit more money invested, you can already get introductory microscopes, which I found to be already significantly better. in many respects. Introductory microscopes are indeed lacking several features. For example, they do not have a condenser. This is an optical system beneath the stage which bundles the light. They are in many cases monocular, so they only have one eyepiece to look through. Generally, they do have a lower image quality because the objectives are not quite as good, but I still have to say that for the price, they're remarkably good already. They're small and portable, so I'm using those introductory microscopes as travel microscopes, for example. Take them easily along. They're battery operated, so they're highly portable. And generally, the maximum magnification that you can achieve with those is 400 times. The largest objective is a 40 times objective, and therefore 40 times objective times 10 times eyepiece gives a maximum meaningful magnification of approximately 400 times, which I would say is already enough for many cases. Yeah. The cost of those microscopes is around $100 or less, or euros or less. And in many cases, they're advertised as having a maximum magnification of 1,000 times. This is basically because of a 25 times magnifying eyepiece, but I would disregard that. Yeah. I recommend those microscopes also to adults who want to try microscopy maybe you are interested to keep up the hobby, or maybe you're not, but they're so cheap really that it's simply worth a try. And I think they're pretty fine for the price. Yeah. Intermediate microscopes are a very common category, and they are quite popular among amateur and hobby microscopists, and they cost from around $300 to around 500 to 500 US dollars or euros. There is a huge selection available here, and that's an important one, but many are quite similar concerning the features. They have a 4 times, 10 times, 40 times, and 100 times oil immersion objective. They have condensers, a mechanical stage, a so-called binocular head with 2 eyepieces. And sometimes they're also advertised as having the maximum magnification of 2,500 times because of the 25 times eyepiece, but I would say that's pretty irrelevant. Those microscopes are, I would say, pretty much all of them made in China. That's a very common place where microscopes are manufactured these days. And there's one important characteristic here that because of their relatively low cost, if something goes wrong and if something breaks, they are not serviceable. There's simply a lack of replacement parts and or it's simply not worth servicing them. Now, if you want to get replacement objectives, it is possible to get them, but sometimes not over the company that sold you or the brand that sold you the microscope, but directly from China. You basically visit AliExpress.com and you can search for microscope objectives, and there you might be able to find exactly the ones that are on your microscope, because indeed, in many cases, many of those microscopes are actually using the same objectives. So I would like to move on concerning the so-called high-end microscopes. As I already mentioned, Nikon, Zeiss, Leica, Olympus, the traditional companies, they're significantly more expensive, and they do provide features that are otherwise not obtainable very easily. It's just, for example, phase contrast microscopy. Sometimes it is available in some lower-cost brands as well. But not quite as common. DIC microscopy, that's called differential interference contrast, are usually can only be found on those high-end microscopes. Specialized objectives like water immersion objectives, apochromatic objectives, and so on. Yeah? And some microscopes even have an electrical control, so you'd have motors that allow you to switch the objectives and focus and so on. A fluorescent microscopy is possible there. So these microscopes are primarily for research applications. And therefore, I would say in most cases, probably not so interesting for amateurs who would like to have a fairly, I would say, low-cost introduction into the hobby. Yeah, these companies also offer educational microscopes. But they're also quite expensive. As a matter of fact, just to give you an example here, the CX23 microscope from Olympus is a pretty good, pretty nice one. It only has 3 objectives, 4 times, 10 times, and 40 times, and I got the offer from the company, and it's approximately 2 to 3 times as expensive as other intermediate microscopes that offer more features, like, for example, a 100 times oil immersion objective. But the mechanical quality of this microscope here is exceptionally high, and maybe also the resale value. So you cannot really, it's difficult to compare them a little bit. But generally what I would recommend is that people who want to buy a microscope probably start off cheap first, and then as they outgrow the device, then they basically know much more already about the microscopy to be able to make a better decision on which microscope to buy. Yeah. So you see, quality here is not really an issue of the image quality or so, but simply of the features that are offered. And I also consider this to be a quality aspect. And last but not least, another important one is serviceability. Is the microscope that you have, can it be serviced and maintained easily? So generally there is the saying that microscopes from the non-top brands, so basically anything much below 700 euros or US dollars, they're simply not serviceable. Either because it's not worth it for cost reasons, or the parts are not available. And there's also a lack of documentation. So if you have a problem with those microscopes, and if you want to fix something because something needs to be maintained, then you essentially have to do it yourself. Now, I have to say that generally, if you take care of a microscope, they can last very long, and there is no real need to service them. But especially if the microscope is to be used over many years, what can happen is that the lubrication oil in the gearing of the focus and of the mechanical stage, they start to solidify, and then you need to take it apart. You need to remove the old oil, and you need to clean everything, and then you need to re-oil everything. And if you want to get this done by a servicing company, they will do that for you. Especially if you, for example, have several of those microscopes to be serviced because maybe you're responsible for them in a school, where you've got, 20, 30, 50 of these microscopes standing around that have to be serviced. Then, of course, the lack of spare parts and documentation and serviceability becomes an issue here. Yeah. And as I mentioned, it's often not necessary, but especially if you are if you have to maintain several microscopes or a large number of microscopes, this might become a problem. Yeah. And just to give you another example, there are high-end microscope objectives, and they might even, one single objective might cost several thousand US dollars or euros. Just the objective, not the whole microscope, just the optics, right? And those objectives, if something goes wrong with them, if you contaminate them because you're not using it correctly, they will have to be taken apart for cleaning. Sometimes if the microscope is not stored properly or in a very humid environment, mold might start to grow on the optical surfaces. Fungus, so this has to be removed and cleaned. And in this case, the objectives have to be taken apart and cleaned and serviced and put back together again. And because those objectives are so extremely expensive, for this reason, it's worth it. But for lower cost objectives, it's simply not worth it. And if something goes wrong, you just basically have to exchange it if you're able to find replacement objectives. And I'm not only talking about replacement objectives, used ones on eBay, but you can also, of course, buy new ones. But as I mentioned before, you might have to go directly shopping at the manufacturers in China, because some of the brands that sell the microscopes locally, even though they import them from China, they might not have the replacement parts available. At least that's a little bit has been my experience here. Yeah, so you see that there are so many different factors to consider here, and all of these issues here are summarized sometimes in one question: is which one's the best microscope to buy, or is this a good microscope? Yeah. And my answer is well, it depends on you, where you place your own values and where you place your importance here. And this is why it makes it so difficult. And remember, one of the comments that I have received is this a good microscope? And then I basically said, well, if you use it a lot and if you're happy with it, then it's a good microscope for you. And then I said, no, that's not what I mean. I mean, am I able to get the same quality images that you're getting on your YouTube videos? And then I have to say, well, actually, it's not really the microscope in this case, but simply the way that I prepared the specimen. So, and I did a lot of contrast enhancement in my video editing software and so on. So there were other factors involved, and it's not the microscope really, but really what I've done with the video afterwards, in the editing process. So you see, there are many different levels here, how this question can be answered. And this basically means, for all practical purposes, is maybe not to overthink it too much, but maybe to start small, maybe not to invest too much money at the beginning, especially if you have not used microscopes before. Yeah, get yourself a reasonably cheap one, maybe not a toy microscope, but maybe an introductory one, and then maybe grow from there. Start making some microscope slides, doing a little bit of nature observation and so on. And then when you outgrow the microscope, then you can always, of course, upgrade it. And those high-end microscopes are so expensive anyway, some of them, that the initial investment that you made is really not such a big investment seen concerning the overall price of everything. Yeah, I think for today I'm going to leave it at that. If you have not yet visited my YouTube channels that I have, please do so. They're called Microbehunter, and the second YouTube channel is called Microbehunter Microscopy. I also have a Patreon account if you want to support me. I have an Amazon affiliate shop as well, where you can support me. Yeah. Of course, you can also subscribe to YouTube channels and or this podcast if you're interested. Yeah, and I think I'm going to leave it at that. I wish you all the best. Happy microbe hunting as always, and see you around next time. Bye-bye.